Devil's Arithmetic, Chapter 1. I'm tired of remembering, Hannah said to her mother as she climbed into the car. She was flushed with April sun and her mouth felt sticky from jelly beans and Easter candy. You know it's Passover, her mom said, sighing in a deliberately voiced low. She kept smiling so that no one at Rosemary's house would know they were arguing. I didn't know. Of course you knew. Then I forgot. Hannah could hear her voice beginning to rise into a whine she couldn't control. How could you forget, Hannah, especially this year, when Passover falls on the same day as Easter? We've talked and talked about it. First, we've got to go home and change. Then we're going to Grandpa Will and Grandma Belle's for the first night's Seder. I'm not hungry. I ate a big dinner at Rosemary's, and I don't want to go to the Seder. Aaron and I will be the only kids there, and everyone will say how much we've grown, even though they just saw us last month. And besides, the punchlines of all the jokes will be in Yiddish. When her mother didn't answer at once, Hannah slumped down in the seat. Sometimes she wished her mother would just yell at her, the way Rosemary's mother did, but she knew her mother would only give her one of those slow, low, reasonable lectures that were so annoying. Passover isn't about eating, Hannah, her mother began at last, sighing and pushing her fingers up through her silver-streaked hair. You could have fooled me, Hannah muttered. It's all about remembering. All Jewish holidays are about remembering, Mama. I'm tired of remembering. Tired or not, you are going with us, young lady. Grandpa Will and Grandma Belle are expecting the entire family, and that means you too. You have to remember how much family means to them. Grandma lost both of her parents to the Nazis before she and her brother managed to escape. And Grandpa? I remember, Hannah whispered. Will lost everyone but your Aunt Eva. A family of 8, all but wiped out. She sighed again, but Hannah suspected there was little sympathy in that sigh. It was more like a punctuation. Instead of putting periods at the end of sentences, her mother sighed. Hannah rolled her eyes up and slipped farther down in the seat. Her stomach felt heavy, as if the argument lay there like the unleavened bread. It wasn't a particularly long trip from New Rochelle to the Bronx, where her grandparents lived, but the car was overheated, as usual, and Aaron complained the entire way. I'm sick, he said loudly. Whenever he was unhappy or scared, his voice got louder. If he was really sick, he could hardly be heard. I'm going to throw up. We have to go back. As her mother turned around and glared at them from the front seat, Hannah patted Aaron's hand and whispered, Don't be such a baby, Ron. The 4 questions aren't that hard. I can't remember all 4 questions. Aaron almost shouted the last word. You don't have to remember them. Hannah's patience was wearing thin. You're supposed to read them from the Haggadah. What if I can't read it right? Hannah began to sigh, caught herself, and turned it into a cough. You've been reading right since you were 3, Mr. Smarty. She cuffed him lightly on the side of the head, and he cried out, Hannah? Her father called back in a warning. Look, she quickly said to Aaron to shut him up. It doesn't matter if you make a mistake, Ron, but if you do, I'll be there right next to you. I'll whisper it into your ear, just like they do in plays when someone forgets a line. Like Mrs. Graham had to do when you forgot, just like that. Promise. She gave him a funny look and then pounced on him, tickling him under the arms and over his belly. When he tried to escape by turning his back on her, she got him again from behind. His laughter rose higher and higher until he almost did throw up. Hannah, her father said again, and her mother stared at them so fiercely over the seat that they drew themselves into opposite corners, staring out their windows with expressions of injured innocence. A few miles farther on, Aaron begged, Tell me a story, Hannah, please. For God's sake, tell him a story, her father said, pounding his right hand against the steering wheel. Driving in city traffic always made him cranky. Glad to be doing something she knew she was good at, Hannah began a gruesome tale about The Walking Dead, borrowing most of the characters, plot, and sound effects from a movie she'd seen on television the night before. Aaron was fascinated by it. The zombies had just marched into the hero's house and eaten his mother when they arrived at the apartment house complex. While their father parked the car, Hannah and Aaron raced into the building. Because he was the youngest, Aaron got to press the elevator button. That's not fair, Hannah began. But then she remembered how scared she had been the first time she had to ask the 4 questions at the Cedar, and she stopped. Instead, she reached out and held his hand tightly as the elevator rose to the 9th floor in a single great swoop. Hannah, how much you have grown, Aunt Rose said. 12 years old and already a beautiful young lady. Hannah smiled and pulled away as soon as she could. 13, she said. It was almost true. She didn't ask Aunt Rose how anyone could be beautiful with mouse brown hair and braces on her teeth. Aunt Rose thought everyone in the family was the most beautiful, the smartest, the greatest, even if it wasn't true. Escaping Aunt Rose's attentions by going to the bathroom, Hannah looked at herself in the mirror. There was a lipstick stain where Aunt Eva had kissed her on the forehead. She ran some water and tried to scrub it off, feeling guilty because Aunt Eva was her favorite aunt, the only one who preferred her over Aaron. Hannah was even named after some friend of Aunt Eva's, some dead friend. The lipstick wouldn't come off completely. Brushing her bangs to hide the mark, Hannah left the bathroom worried that someone else might be lying in wait for her and dreading it. Chapter 2. No one even noticed Hannah's entrance into the living room. They were all in a tight semicircle around Grandpa Will. He was sitting in the big overstuffed chair in front of the TV set, waving his fist and screaming at the screen. Across the screen marched old photos of the Nazi concentration camp victims, corpses stacked like cordwood and dead-eyed survivors. As the horrible pictures flashed by, a dark voice announced the roll of camps: Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, Chelmno, Dachau. Give him this! Grandpa Will shouted at the TV, holding up his left arm to the set. The sleeve of his shirt was rolled up above the elbow. The photograph of a Nazi colonel standing sharply at attention flashed by. I'll give him this! Aunt Eva was shaking her head as Uncle Sam snapped off the TV set. Then she murmured, Please forgive him, please. It was the war. Her voice was as soft as a prayer. Hannah sighed. He's starting it again, she whispered to Aaron. Aaron shrugged. Hannah could scarcely remember when Grandpa Will didn't have these strange fits, showing off the tattoo on his left arm and screaming in both English and Yiddish. When she'd been younger, the 5-digit number on his arm had fascinated her. It was a dark blue, very much like a stain. The skin around it had gotten old, but the number had not. Right after Aaron's birth, at his re-party, when all the relatives had been making fools of themselves over him, Hannah had taken a ballpoint pen and written a string of numbers on the inside of her own left arm, hard enough to almost break the skin. She had thought it might please Grandpa Will as much as the new baby had. For a moment he stared at her uncomprehendingly. Then suddenly he grabbed at her, screaming in Yiddish, Malak HaMavis, over and over, his face gray and horrible. Everyone at the party had watched them. It had taken her father and Aunt Eva a long, long time to calm him down. Even though they tried to explain to her what had upset Grandpa Will so, Hannah had never quite forgiven him. It took 2 days of hard scrubbing before the pen marks were gone. She still occasionally dreamed of his distorted face and the guttural screams. Strangely, though, she never dared ask what the words meant. In her dreams, she seemed to know. No one had ever volunteered to tell her. It was as if they had all forgotten the incident, but Hannah had not. Mama, Hannah said when the TV was turned off and calm restored to the room at last. Why does he bother with it? It's all in the past. There aren't any concentration camps now. Why bring it up? It's embarrassing. I don't want any of my friends to meet him. What if he shouts at them or does something else crazy? Grandpa Dan doesn't shout at the TV or talk about the war like that. Grandpa Dan wasn't in the camps, thank God. He was born in America just like you. That's because my family came over to this country in the early 1900s, second class, not steerage. She got that faraway look that signaled she was about to recite another part of the family saga. Hannah knew there was only one escape. I think I'll help Aunt Eva in the kitchen, she said quickly, and ran from the room before her mother could continue. Although it was Grandma Bell's place to light the candles in her own home, over the years it had become a family tradition to let Aunt Eva do it. compensation for her not having a house or a family of her own. Aunt Eva could have been married, not once, but 3 different times, though, as Hannah's mother had pointed out, she was no great beauty. But Aunt Eva had preferred living with her brother, Will, and his wife, helping them raise Hannah's father when Belle was away at work. Why did she do it? Hannah had often asked. Because she wanted to, was the only answer her father had ever given. Maybe she likes kids, Rosemary suggested once. Maybe she likes cleaning house. I have an aunt like that. And what does she do? Hannah asked. She's a nun. Don't be a jerk. Jews don't become nuns. So they live with their brother and take care of his kids. His kid, Hannah said. My father's an only child. But none of the answers satisfied Hannah's needs for a romance and a perfect story. Still, she eventually stopped asking questions, and the only issue she ever brought up with Aunt Eva herself had to do with the everyday things, like how many teaspoons of sugar went to a glass of iced tea, or what took a stain out of a leather skirt, or how to knit a scarf, or make potato soup, or where to find an old-fashioned shoes for the school play. Aunt Eva had always had the answer to those sort of things. When Hannah had been younger, Aunt Eva's answers had seemed magical, but as Hannah got older, the magic disappeared, leaving Aunt Eva in a very ordinary person. Hannah hated that it was so, so she pushed the thought away. Still, when Aunt Eva lit the holiday candles, broad hands encircling the light, her plain face with its deep-set coffee-colored eyes took on a kind of beauty. The flickering flame made her almost look young. Watching Aunt Eva saying the prayers over the candles was the one moment in all the family gatherings that Hannah had always found special. If it was as if she and her aunt shared a particular bond at those times, as if the magic was still somehow alive. The Yarzit for all the beloved dead, a grace for the beloved living, Aunt Eva always whispered to Hannah before reciting the Hebrew prayers. Hannah whispered along with her. Even Aaron tried to get in on the act, but he mumbled the words in a full beat behind. Annoyed, Hannah poked him in the side, but he shifted away. In frustration, she caught up the fleshy part of his upper arm between her fingers and pinched. He cried out. Hannah, her father said sharply. Hannah felt her face grow red, and she looked down at her plate. Chapter 3. During the endless Seder dinner and the even more endless explanations from the Haggadah, Hannah frequently glanced out the window. A full moon was squeezed between two of the project's apartment buildings. Her grandfather droned on and on about the plagues and the exodus from Egypt. Maybe it was an interesting story if someone else told it, Hannah thought, but Grandpa Will had a voice that buzzed like the plague of locusts. He made sour lessons at every pause. The Seder wasn't even in the right order, not like they taught in Sunday school. When Hannah tried to protest, she was shushed down by Uncle Sam. It's Will's way. Don't make trouble, he said. Hannah stared at the moon. Tomorrow they'd be going to Grandpa Dan's for the next Seder. At least there would be 3 cousins her own age, all boys, but that couldn't be helped. And they'd get to sit at the kitchen table away from the grown-ups. And Grandpa Will wouldn't be there shouting and making a scene. Only Grandpa Dan, sweet, gentle, silly Grandpa Dan, who told stories in between the readings and said things like, How do I know? I was there. Beside her, Aaron was moving restlessly, getting ready to ask the second question. With the yarmulke covering his fair hair, he looked like a miniature Grandpa Will. Hannah almost laughed aloud, remembering what Rosemary had said at her first and only holiday visit. Why do they wear those beanies? Aaron's hand shook, and a page in the Haggadah flipped over by itself. Hannah reached out and smoothed it back for him, and he smiled up at her gratefully. He has the greatest smile, Hannah thought. He won't need braces. Stop worrying, she mouthed at him. At her urging, he plunged into the second question, chanting the Hebrew perfectly because he'd memorized it. But when he looked down at the book to read the English translation, he stumbled over the word herb, pronouncing it with the H. Uncle Sam snorted, and Aaron stopped, mortified. He looked around the table. Everyone was smiling at him. It was clear he made some silly mistake, but he didn't know what it was he'd done. And he turned helplessly to Hannah. Herb, she whispered. Don't pronounce the H. He nodded gratefully and started on the English again, finishing too loudly and in a rush, a sure sign he was unhappy. On all the other nights we eat vegetables and herbs of all kinds. Why on this night do we eat bitter herbs especially? Why indeed, Hannah wondered, since they're so disgusting. Rosemary gets to eat jelly beans, and I get to eat horseradish. It isn't fair, she realized suddenly. She spoke the last words aloud, and everyone had heard. Embarrassed, she stared down at her hands, but her anger at the injustice continued. Of course it isn't fair, whispered Aunt Eva to her. But what has fair got to do with it? She smiled, and to break the tension, she started singing Dayenu in her strong musical voice. The rousing, repetitive song carried them all along, even Hannah's mother, who was tone deaf. Hannah knew it meant it would have been enough, but she suddenly felt that nothing was enough except to get out of that room and that cedar in which nothing was fair or fun was happening. Then she remembered the wine. That, at least, was new. When the cedar began again, she would get another glass of watered wine. For the first time, she was being allowed to drink along with the grown-ups. Let Hannah enjoy the toast for real, Will had said, before the cedar had begun. Now, Poppy, Hannah's mother protested. She's only 12. 13, Hannah said. Eva patted her hand. And when my sister Eva was 13, what she would have given to have a little glass of watered wine, Grandpa Will had begun. It was the same kind of argument he used for everything. He never had to finish a sentence, for no one could withstand the promise of guilt. All right, Poppy. Grandpa Will had smiled, turning to Eva. See, they can't keep her a baby forever. Babies like Aaron had to make do with grape juice. Hannah had been grateful to her grandfather for that, and she had discovered for the very first toast that she liked the sweet, cloying taste of wine, even though it made her head buzz. Hannah! Aaron tugged on her sleeve, and his eyes were full of mischief. It's time. Time? For a moment, she thought he meant the time for the next toast. Then she realized he meant time to still the afikoman, the mazta wrapped in the blue embroidered cloth. Looking around the table, she saw that the adults were suddenly very busy talking to one another. She remembered when, as the only child, she had been the one to take the afikoman. She thought herself terribly clever when she found it under Uncle or Grandpa Will's chair. Of course, now she knew that he always hid it there for easy discovery. She smiled at Aaron, suddenly feeling very adult. You go look for it. I'll keep watch here. Okay. He slipped from his chair and crawled around to the head of the table. Then he leapt to his feet, holding the blue cloth and its crumbling contents high over his head. I found it, Poppy. Now I get to hide it. He ran from the room, but no one leaped up to follow. He's going to hide it in the bathroom, Hannah said to no one in particular. He always does. Hush, Hannah Lee, don't spoil things, Aunt Rose said. You always hid the afikoman under Grandma Bell's pillow, Aunt Eva said. You knew? Uncle Sam guffawed. You left enough crumbs. Knowing and not knowing, her mother said and sighed. It's all a part of the game, and the game is to uncover the hidden order of the universe. Cedar means order. I read that in a book. What hidden order? Grandpa Will said. Do you think there was an order back in the camps? Do you think? Eva interrupted smoothly. Lily, you are much too serious about these things. Let the children play. They are children for such a short time, and it's not as if we keep kosher or do things as Rabbi would. We do it for the children. Isn't that right, Belle? Grandma Bell nodded. So they can have fun and remember their history. Brushing the stray wisps of white hair from her broad forehead, Eva rose. Here we come, Aaron, ready or not. Signaling the others to follow her, she left the dining room. The men stayed at the table, but Aunt Eva and Aunt Rose went to the bedroom in a noisy search. Hannah's mother was almost as loud, looking about the kitchen. They spent many minutes calling out to each other about how difficult Aaron was to find this year, until Grandpa Will put his fingers to his mouth and let out a piercing whistle and brought them all back. Hannah had been waiting at the bathroom door as if on guard. At the whistle, the door opened and Aaron peeked out. Hannah! I'm in here, he whispered. Big surprise, Hannah said, slipping into the room. Look where I hid Afikaman. He took the blue cloth out of the dirty clothes basket. That's disgusting, Aaron. Hiding it in someone's laundry? They never even looked in here, Hannah. I flushed the toilet and pretended to be going, and no one came in, he grinned. You're so smart, Ron. Hannah had to laugh at his earnestness. What are you going to ask Poppy for? A baseball glove. She knew how much he wanted one. He'd been saving his Hanukkah money and doing extra chores. Good choice, she said. No matter what Poppy offers you to buy back the Afikaman, you hold out for that glove. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror, wondering when the braces would come off. This summer, if she was lucky. I got a Barbie doll dress collection once. She didn't admit that she regretted it right after. When she turned to say something else, Aaron was already gone. The rest of the Passover meal was tempting, but Hannah had eaten so much at Rosemary's, she only picked at her food. Besides, her head was beginning to throb. Uncle Sam poured another quarter glass of wine into her glass and filled it the rest of the way with water for the next blessing. Suddenly, she wasn't sure she wanted it anymore. My head feels funny, she said to her mother. I told you she was too young for wine, her mother said with a sigh. Even watered wine. Uncle Sam handed around a large cut crystal goblet, Elijah's cup, and poured everyone a little bit of the wine from their own glasses into it. When it was Hannah's turn, she emptied her entire glass. Elijah can have it all, she said grandly. Grandpa Will smiled down at the long table at her. What a good girl, for being so unselfish. You can open the door for the prophet and welcome him in. I wanted to do that, Aaron called out. That's the most fun. Hannah will do it, Aaron, Grandpa Will said, because she was so generous with her gift. He can have my whole cup too, Aaron said. A sacrifice unasked is so much the greater, Grandpa Will stated flatly. Come, Hannah. Hannah stood reluctantly. She felt like a fraud. She hadn't given the wine out of generosity, but only because she didn't want it. It was no sacrifice. Remember, Hannah Lay, we open our door to remind ourselves of the time Jews were forced to keep their doors open, to show the Christians we were not practicing blood rituals. Ha! His last syllable was a noisy punctuation, as if we were the bloody ones. Aunt Eva leaned over and laid her hand quietly on his. It was enough to calm him. He smiled at Hannah. Open the door, Elijah. Open the door to Elijah, child, and invite him in with an open heart. Slowly, Hannah moved toward the front door, feeling incredibly dumb. She certainly didn't believe that the prophet Elijah would come through the apartment door any more than she believed Darth Vader or Robin Hood or the Easter Bunny would. No one believed in those superstitions anymore. No one except babies like Aaron. Glancing over her shoulder, Hannah saw that they were all watching her intently. Aaron bounced up and down on his chair. Open it, Hannah, he called loudly. Open it for Elijah. Baby stories, she thought angrily. Unlatching the double bolt, flinging open the door wide, she whispered, Ready or not, here I come. Outside, where there should have been a long windowless hall with dark green numbers leading into other apartments, there was a greening field and a lowering sky. A moon hung ripely between two heavy gray clouds. A bird pelted the air with a strange lilting song. And across the field, stepping in furrows, marched a shadowy figure. He had a shapeless cap on his head, a hoe over his shoulder, and he was singing. Who asked you to be buried alive? You know that no one forced you. You took this madness upon yourself.